You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
He was a statesman, one whose place in our political system was akin to one of those tremendous phenomena we read about in the tropics, when our nature is in volcanic lands. He was superb in masculine beauty, with a well-modeled head, full beard, and a pendant curl atop his forehead. Now, I'd love to be able to say that we are talking about Chet Arthur here in this account, but no, this account is of Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, the person that Arthur is probably most associated with, political boss, Senator Stalwart. We call Roscoe Conkling a stalwart, like the papers would have at the time, and that word probably gets a bad rap, stalwart. It sounds like the political machines, like evil people, preserving jobs, being corrupt, and celebrating it. And there are elements of that that are true. But like everything in history, you have to examine it a little bit more. To some degree, if we like jobs by merit instead of by party affiliation, we should consider that. Because while it meant that he could be considered a boss, and he was, a party love it or leave it type guy, especially because he was controlling the party, he was also what that word means, a stalwart. Loyal to Thurlow Weed during the Whig days and his New York political machine, loyal to Seward, loyal to the cause of the Civil War, when Seward was removed from possibility of being Republican president and Abraham Lincoln was the choice, loyal to Lincoln and defended him as president, but also loyal to the prerogatives of the Congress, and stalwart in his stance against Andrew Johnson, and cast his vote for that president's impeachment. When that chapter was concluded, he was loyal to Ulysses S. Grant. And indeed, he was a fighter, both in rhetoric and sometimes in person. He had some boxing experiences, and he'd need it, because the Congress of the Civil War period, as you might know, sometimes had violence. You heard about the caning of Senator Sumner, attacked by the nephew of a man who he had made Shakespearean insults about. And so congressmen who were more of an abolitionist stance, like Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, how come he didn't get caned the way Sumner did? They had the same politics. And that's because of Roscoe Conkling, who would act as personal bodyguard for several members of Congress who were of that persuasion. You're not going to cane anybody on Conkling's watch. Because we have to, we are going to start our story here talking about someone who's not Chester Arthur. I mean, we should say that at this time, Arthur, prior to taking up the reins more later, was working for somebody. He's going to be, throughout this episode, somewhat of a background figure until the very end, when he moves to the foreground. And that's just the way you have to think about Chester Arthur, and that's one of the reasons that he's become a bit obscure in history, except for maybe a couple of stories. If anybody gets into civil service reform, later, they'll talk about him and things like that. Because he's background. If I use kind of the modern terms that I don't always like because they're so generalized, But certainly Conkling's the alpha here and Arthur's the beta. But as we're going to get, he was a very well-networked and a very successful and even rich, at a certain point, beta, if you will. He's pulling the strings. He's working the organization. But that organization, we must note, is run by Conkling. He's not inactive. Arthur, for the period after the Civil War where we left you in the last episode, he transitions from public service to an active law practice. And there are clients, because after the war, people are seeking compensation for war-related damages, businesses that hadn't been paid, disputes over property loss or damage to commercial enterprises, broken contracts due to the Civil War that some in New York City would now like to enforce. If someone had shipped something down south, perhaps they want the money now if there's someone to collect it from. These are all things that one might pursue, and Arthur might be their lawyer. Families who had homes that they owned destroyed. Not all homes down south were owned by Southerners who would seek, their own courts, but some New Yorkers owned property down there. You see Arthur in a lot of places building his credibility, and his name appears in papers in the late 1860s and in a bunch of things. In 1867, a bill introduced by Senator Lent names corporators Robert Hawthorne, James P. Brewster, and Dickinson, among others, of the New York Long Island Bridge Company, with power to construct a permanent bridge over the East River between the city of New York and Long Island, with capital stock of $500,000 to be sold. And the names listed are also Allen Dennis, Charles Leveridge, and Chester Allen Arthur. Now, does that mean that he'd be behind the Brooklyn Bridge? No, these guys never got their bridge done. This bridge would have been much farther up. Also listed in the formation of a Central Grant Committee in 1867. Conservative Republicans met last evening to organize a Grant Club. E. Delafield Smith has been elected temporary chairman. Among the members are a Chester Arthur. He is in the New York Daily Herald, named as a streetcar commissioner in New York City. So Arthur's not an elected person, but he's rising in all of these smaller committees. He's central to what's going to be the successful Republican presidential candidate. He's rising in politics. And by that you have to read, he's rising in the esteem of Roscoe Conkling, who trusted him to take these positions and frankly knew that many would find his point of view a bit more friendlier in the face of Arthur than himself. Sometimes that friendlier face is retained in history as his image, but affability never served Arthur poorly. As terms of Conkling, you wouldn't call Conkling a likable man. As Navy Secretary Gideon Wills once said, an egotistical coxcomb. Haughty, superstitious, as vain as a peacock, and a czar in arrogance. Lord Roscoe, many called him, and he carried himself like a member of the high peerage. This according to a biographer. You didn't cross Conkling. Those who did found that they went from making a comment, maybe even apologizing afterwards, to never speaking to him again. That went for people who were on the same side or opposite side of politics, whether they were in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. There is a long dispute between Conkling and James Blaine, and it starts when they're congressmen in the 1860s during the Civil War. And Blaine sees Conkling, and I think that, frankly, Conkling wasn't afraid of anyone. Blaine wasn't afraid of anyone. And Blaine wanted to take down the person who was biggest to build himself up. I mean, that's really what it is. He looked at the schoolyard and saw the bully and attacks Conkling in a speech. He just makes fun of him, says that he has a turkey gobbler strut, and that he's oh so sarcastic. I'm oh so afraid of his biting oratory. Everything that's an asset for Conkling. Blaine turns it around and makes fun of it. And those who had got the other side of Conkling in Congress flocked to Blaine. Blaine's eventually going to get elected speaker. So Blaine's an enormously crafty politician, and these two are going to fight it out for the rest of their lives. And in fact, after the turkey gobbler strut comment, someone asked, would you ever repair, with Blaine? And Conkling simply says, he attacked me without provocation. I will not speak to him again. And he did not. Conkling didn't care what people thought of him in this way. The stakes were high. New York was the important state in either Republican or Democratic politics. It's the biggest state. It has the most electoral votes, the most congressional districts. And more to the point, it's not guaranteed to be one way or the other. The city of New York, controlled by the Tammany Hall machine, is Democratic. There are Democratic machines also in Queens County, Kings County, the Bronx. There's strong machines there that can win elections. Republicans are stronger upstate. So this is quite a contested state with two strong political machines. Conkling comes from that upstate. He's the mayor of Utica before he was 30. He's elected to Congress in 1857. He speaks in Utica on behalf of Lincoln, and his speech is noted for its force. He was a foe of any compromise with the South that would have betrayed the Republican Party's anti-slavery extension platform. He supports Lincoln's use of executive authorities, but he also was a supporter of congressional authority and didn't see a contradiction in that, especially as generals seemed to be running a war in a different way than Lincoln wanted, and certainly a different way than the Congress wanted. After the Ball's Bluff disaster, where Union troops were walking right into Confederate fire, he says, at a speech on the floor, "Let mismanagement and drowsiness tremble and wake up." The House is electrified by the speech. The House adopts a formal resolution that the Secretary of War should report to the House what measures had been taken to ascertain who is responsible. Secretary Cameron won't do it. Conkling then makes another speech, and there's a Senate proposal to constitute a joint committee on the conduct of the war, the Senate and the House together, and they'll bring generals before if they don't think they're fighting hard enough. And I can tell you, if you're a Civil War general on the Union side, you do not want to appear before this body. It bedeviled President Lincoln even for the rest of the war, and it scared the heck out of generals, perhaps made them more afraid. But I bring this all up to say that when we hear the term stalwart, and we only think about, if we think about it at all, the battle between the half-breeds and the stalwarts, the battle between the reformers and the stalwarts in the 19th century Republican Party, we cannot forget that there's an element of stalwart, which means standing up against slavery, which means standing up for the Republican platform, for the prosecution of the war, and for stronger Reconstruction. There's something that they're being stalwart about. And Conkling, Arthur's boss, cannot be seen as just a kind of like fat cat political boss sitting in a corner, doling out patronage to people. Though he did that, he is a highly muscular, not so fat cat, doling patronage out to people, but also able to speak, to electrify crowds. So he's a politician boss. No, not everyone likes this. His own brother-in-law gets elected to New York governor, Horatio Seymour, as a Democrat. Conkling himself loses re-election in 1862 to a war Democrat. But he eventually makes it back in. Some Republicans wanted to get rid of him that time. Said the Democrats have done part of the work for us. They tell Lincoln, don't endorse him for all the reasons usually. He's arrogant, etc. But Lincoln endorses Conkling to get his seat back. No one could be more satisfactory to me than Conkling. His vigorous support for emancipation and the measures friendly to the president. The faction opposed to him is unfriendly to me. And so he says, I don't mean to say that there are not others as good as he in his district, but I think I know him to be least good enough. So Lincoln sees the merit in this guy that supported all his policies versus people who might be reformers and be a little shaky. Eventually, after the war, after Lincoln's assassination, Conkling's elected to the Senate by the state legislature of New York, and there he has a rivalry with the governor of that state, Reuben Fenton, also later a senator from that state, for power. So these two senators, Reuben Fenton and Roscoe Conkling, could not be more different. Reuben Fenton is a reform Republican. Roscoe Conkling is a stalwart. He wants to build an organization. He wants the spoils to go to Republicans. He wants to consistently beat Democrats so that they aren't taking the jobs and giving the spoils to their own members. And you could say a lot about Fenton, and he has a whole story too that you could talk about. And it's one of these rivalries for power within New York State in the years after the Civil War that could have gone the other way. Fenton really could have. He was a pretty powerful person himself, having been governor, could have taken the apparatus. But Conkling wins out. And kind of one by one, little by little, he removes the Fenton people, particularly after Fenton's not governor anymore. Because he stops being governor in 1870. He stops being governor in 1868 and loses the election to Hoffman, a Democrat. He's considered in 1868, Fenton is, to be one of the vice presidential candidates to Grant. But he loses that out to Schuyler Colfax. That's kind of the height of his political power. And from there, Conkling not only picks up the baton of power from Fenton, but begins to replace every person he could. Here's from Purley's Reminiscences. Mr. Conkling was at that time a type of manly beauty. You see this a lot, right? These are different people and you're seeing the same description, so something must be true. Broad shoulders, compact chest, a carriage. He is always dressed with scrupulous neatness, wearing a dark frock coat, light-colored vest, and trousers and gaiters buttoned over his shoes. His nose was very large and prominent, his eyes of a bluish gray hue, surmounted by dark auburn eyebrows, side whiskers curled closely, and hair ran down with a sharp point to the middle of his broad, bald forehead. His language was elegant. When he spoke on the floor, every word was clearly enunciated, while slow and deliberate gestures lent effect to what he said. At times his features would light up with animation. His deep nostrils would quiver and lengthen into the expression of scorn, which would often lash an opponent into fury. He took no prisoners, and sometimes, boy, have you ever seen this in recent politics, sometimes what he would do is kind of sneer and scoff and be sarcastic to an opponent, which would bring them down to his level in return. But Conkling was better at it, and he did this quite often. Here's where Arthur comes into the story. While he's involved in the Grant clubs and the political organization in the Republican Party, starting to become very important there as Conkling's man. He's also a member of the Union League Club of New York City, which was founded in 1863 during the Civil War by a group of concerned citizens determined to preserve the Union. It's long been a bastion of civic involvement. It has dining rooms, social halls, hosts speakers ranging from policymakers to noted authors, and it serves as an incubator for strategic alliances among New York's financial and political elite. There's a slight difference between Conkling and Arthur in some of these things going on in New York City, where Arthur is a member of the Union Club, has a little bit more of a cultural connection to some in the city, and Conkling is not wasting his time with a club like that. Between 1869 and 1870, Arthur served as chief counsel to the New York City Tax Commission and plunged into the complexities of urban finance at a time that the city was struggling with the aftershocks of war. He had to assess taxes on a wide variety of entities, from city employees to businesses. Had an annual salary of $10,000, which is a lot at that time. And his role was pivotal in shaping a financial framework to support the city's recovery and growth. So it depended, of course, on your viewpoint and what side of politics you come from. But this person who's now obscure in history books, in New York City at the time of the Civil War, would have been known as the guy that fixed the defenses of the city during that Civil War, prominent lawyer, and now is fixing the finances of the city. Or you might have seen him as a crook, or at the lightest, just slightly corrupt. There's all of these stories that come out in the newspapers about General Arthur. And by the way, that's the way Arthur would be referred to in the newspapers from the time of the Civil War up until the time that he becomes vice president. The title they would use is general. He had general rank in the Union Army as quartermaster general for the state of New York. So he would be called General Arthur. General Arthur would have been seen prominently, or in Democratic newspapers, they were replete with stories about how he was easily bribed during the Civil War, how, he overcharged the U.S. government for all sorts of things. Members of the Union League Club over time would include 15 presidents, all sorts of senators, J. Pierpont Morgan, William Cullen Bryant, the poet and newspaper author, and that just shows you how prestigious it is and such a networking event. One of the things they're able to achieve is the election of Grant, with New York as a no-question state for Grant once he was nominated, both in the nomination process in 1868 and then in winning the state. From 1869 onward, the junior senator from New York, with Chester Arthur at his side, was Grant's most steadfast supporter. And in turn, Grant's going to make it possible for Conkling to become the dominant figure. One of Grant's early foreign policy initiatives is the annexation of San Domingo, where the Dominican Republic is. Now, this is a controversial point in history. It's not a well thought of in modern times about Grant, but let's just say it was controversial, and particularly people who were reform Republicans didn't like the plan very much. Not only did it seem warlike, exploitive, but it was seen in two different ways. Really what Grant wanted is a naval station in this area, but there's also a thought that it would make a lot of folks rich, and maybe that's the reason it's going on. Conkling supports Grant throughout this controversial matter of San Domingo, which is opposed in the Senate. Reuben Fenton, the other senator, does not. Fenton fawned over Grant. Grant didn't like that. Conkling was one that would go to the president and say, this is not a good idea if it wasn't, and stick to his guns. And Grant preferred that. So he had both personal and political reasons. When it was time to appoint a new collector for the port of New York, the largest job and highest paying job in the federal system, the busiest port in the United States, this relationship with Grant would prove crucial. The job of collector carried many responsibilities, many perks, presents opportunities. Conkling and Reuben Fenton are rivals to get their choices in. Each man wanted to dominate. So Conkling wants a fellow Thomas Murphy, who is a Republican machine operator. Arthur would have known him well. Fenton wants William Robertson. Conkling throws his support to Murphy, and Grant appoints Thomas Murphy to the position over Fenton's choice. This is a big deal at this time. I mean, this is like the plum assignment. So then when Grant appoints Thomas Murphy, Fenton doesn't stay quiet. He tries to oppose Murphy now on the Senate floor. Roscoe Conkling gives a speech in which he produces proof that Fenton had taken $12,000 as a young man rather than deliver it as a courier. Fenton had claimed that he didn't take the money. He was robbed. According to Arthur Ron Chernow's account, upon seeing the documents that Conkling had, Fenton slumped over his desk in defeat. He could no longer be an ally to Robertson and had to give up the fight on the floor. Conkling got his wish. Murphy got the power that he craved. But Murphy went in there like a hammer and used it aggressively. That's what Grant and Conkling wanted. In other words, they wanted the people who had been Republicans, who were appointed, who were on the other side of things, who weren't in the Conkling machine, wanted them gone. That's a lot of people. There's a lot of port collectors under the top collector position. And Murphy antagonized all of these little factions within New York Republican politics by firing their members from custom house jobs and replacing them with Conkling men, so that Conkling has all of it. Murphy actually, in doing this will for Grant and Conkling, gets so unpopular that Grant has to fire him. And so who do we put in? Well, there is former Quartermaster General Chester A. Arthur, who is now appointed to the place, and there's no opposition in the Senate. This position makes Chester Arthur up to $50,000. The salary's a fraction of that, but the money was made in fines that you would assess to merchants. But lest we think that Chester Arthur just gets this job. See, there's an image you might have of these government jobs. You can just be barking orders at merchants whose ships come in. Give me, you're fined, give me this money. Being unwise with hefty fines. It was a clear balancing act, something Chester Arthur's early years had prepared him for. 75% of tariffs going to the federal government passed through Arthur's office. All the more important, because tariffs were the most important source of revenue at this time, didn't have the income tax yet, to the U.S. government. Arthur has 280 employees. This is an office that the roots go all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. He brought in $108 million, in 1870s dollars, to the United States and collected a fee of 10% annually. That's 10% to the custom house, not to him necessarily. He had 5 deputies, and 4 deputies and 5 deputies each under them, and then many other collectors who would make their money from what they had assessed. But the collector's at the top. There's also a U.S. surveyor, U.S. appraiser, the U.S. naval officer. Now, the job of the naval officer, they're all really important jobs. Naval officer would, to some degree, check over the collector, be the kind of make sure that everything was doing well. Surveyors would work on the docks and the vessels and would run the inspectors' offices and all the ways and measures. If you see Arthur at this time, he'd look like a dandy. Lamb-chopped beard, great dress. Really, how he got here was being a very good organizer. This is a very big job. And I just think that it's one of these things in this 4-part podcast we're just going to be doing is separating that look of the man that you see that in today's history that seems irrelevant, and some of that was contemporary too. He's definitely cartooned as when he later become president, as a sleepy president with him and his cabinet members in a cartoon with sleeping hats on. But I think you're talking about the bit older Arthur and some of the Bright's disease starting, and some of it's from political opponents. It's Puck. Puck is a Democratic magazine. Really funny cartoons, but a Democratic magazine. That image is out there about him. He's routinely attacked in papers for wild accusations, as we said, both for his role as Quartermaster General in the Civil War and what he's doing now in the Port Collector. But by all accounts, the exaggerated attacks are not true. He supervises nearly 1,300 agents. The domain includes the entire coast of New York State, Hudson River, parts of New Jersey. His salary is $12,000. He gets $50,000, as we discussed. Arthur routinely collects salary kickbacks from custom house employees to support Boss Conkling's machine. He does this every year. He does this before every election. He does it religiously. He rewrites letters if people refuse. You have an official that is actually employed in a civil service job, Silas Burt. And while Silas Burt had been a loyal party member, he's like, I'm in a civil service job. I can't be kicking back part of my salary to the Republican Party. And Arthur writes him a fairly firm note that he's not, he's allowing others to do the hard work and not standing up. Yeah, Arthur wanted his money. In 1871, our friend Reuben Fenton attempted to introduce a bill to end the fees paid to custom workers from merchant fees. It's not successful. Chester Arthur lives comfortably in middle-class New York. Even as the country suffered from economic depressions, he has 5 servants. He resides in one of the best neighborhoods near Madison Square Park, like the best area. His summers were often spent in Newport, Rhode Island, where he moved within high society. He's always impeccably dressed. His wife, Nell, was an ambitious Southern woman who maintained an active social life, keeping up with all of Arthur's friends and making an impression with her gregarious nature, their kind words. She loved horseback riding and other outdoor pursuits. Their son Alan was given a proper education and maintained a formal relationship with his father, addressing him as Sir. But Arthur was frequently the collector's job. He would have been mobbed by people day and into the night, dinners at night, working late into the night, dining at odd hours. Silas Burt once remarked that Arthur laced his clothing tightly to conceal his corpulence. Others noted his understated elegance, favoring an English style, a Prince Albert coat, light trousers, a collection of hats. Hats alone cost him $125 in the year 1875. He was a man of refinement who could recite poetry, enjoyed fishing, was active in numerous social clubs. He earned nearly as much as the president. And reform movements glagged onto that. We'll talk about a few of these people. George William Curtis, the publisher of Harper's Weekly. Significant reformer, aligned with Republicans, but someone who wanted reform. Charles Francis Adams, from that great family, wanted reforms in the civil service, to cut down on some of the fees collected, to cut down on the kickbacks. Charles Bonaparte, I know the name is interesting, right? But yeah, he's the great nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, but he's not really associated with France. He's actually American through and through. His great-grandfather was Jerome Bonaparte, who was the youngest brother of... He was a progressive. He'd later become Secretary of the Navy during Roosevelt's time. E.L. Godkin, very important. All of these people are starting to start a movement. There's a congressman in Rhode Island who proposes civil service legislation during the Civil War. That's when it starts. And then President Andrew Johnson, coming in from the Democratic side, starts picking this issue up. And so do many Democrats, because they're not in power. So they're looking at the Republicans making all their friends rich and say, this isn't right. You start to see this movement building. As a member of the Union League Club, Arthur supported high tariffs, wise government spending, cultivated relationships with business leaders. His decision to make his correspondence with merchants public was very different from collectors in the past. So that's a step that people see, a so-called, you'd call it today, transparency step. Actually, the letters that I'm writing assessing merchants that come in, I'm going to make that public. You can see what I'm doing. People like that. Business leaders in New York appreciate his approach. The New York Times praises collector Arthur's ability to perform his duties while retaining the confidence of merchants. And the New York Times at this time is not as big a paper as it is today, but it's definitely a paper that's seen as often railing against. Even Harper's Weekly noted that his prompt, courteous, and intelligent discharge of duties had earned him the public esteem. But there's a scandal that hits the Custom House. The Phelps Dodge scandal. Investigations revealed that officials had used fake invoices and threats to extract more revenue. Phelps Dodge is one of them. And initially, this merchant firm is told they owe $200,000 in unpaid excise taxes. But we'll offer you a settlement of $20,000 and make it go away. This is done by an inspector well under Arthur, not Arthur himself. The company's leadership later admitted they'd been deceived. And when approached by investigators, they testify against the customs house. That shows how powerful Arthur is in his political connections. He's not even asked to testify by the investigative committee. Oh, we know Arthur has nothing to do with that. And he distanced himself from the scandal. Subordinates that did the wrongdoing. Now, Arthur had received money from Phelps Dodge. He received a portion of that $20,000, as he would with all fines. So Phelps Dodge doesn't hurt Arthur directly. It certainly has indirect effects on how people view this office. But by 1874, Congress repeals laws that allow custom collectors to take a percentage of fines and introduced a requirement. You can't just tell merchants, we're going to have an investigation unless you pay us. You have to have a court order to do an investigation. They can no longer intimidate businesses with arbitrary fines. And actually, this legislation, definitely you might say, Arthur is able to use it to his advantage because he implements everything according to the law and avoids any direct confrontation. Conkling fights this new legislation on the Senate floor, speaks out against it, tries to amend it to death, all of these tactics, but when it comes up to a final vote, he knows he's lost. And even Conkling, the boss of New York, votes for it to limit the salary of his buddy Arthur. President Grant hesitates to sign it. This would disrupt a system that's instrumental in funding political campaigns. This is how campaigns are funded in the 19th century. You take a cut of each government employee. Their salary, they kick it to the party. Arthur's salary is reduced, but he keeps his reputation, and he's seen as the guy who's implementing these reforms now. It's the newly reformed custom house under Arthur. There's even a newspaper that says, this is no longer the type of custom house that shakes down merchants. In effect, that's what they say. So the reformers had won a blow, but as we're going to see, there's a lot of back and forth in this. And the Stalwarts, Arthur Conkling included, had big plans for 1876. They're going to run one of their own for the highest office in the land because Grant's had his 2 terms. Here's from Pearlie's about 1876. The centennial year, the Republic was ushered in Washington with the usual rejoicings. Although the weather was deep and foggy, there were nocturnal services in several of the Episcopal churches and watch meetings at the Methodist churches, and several of the temperance organizations continued in session until after midnight. And there was much social visiting just before 12. The chime bells of the Metropolitan Methodist Church played hymns. The fire alarm bells struck 1, 7, 7, 6, 1, 7, 7, 6, 1776. Each bell has a number. And as the observatory clock sounded the hour of 12, the fire alarm bells struck 1876 now at the same moment. Do you imagine being in the city at that time with all of those fire alarm bells and all the different houses going off at the same time like this? Meanwhile, the brilliant light in the Tholos, which surmounts the dome of the Capitol in D.C., was lighted by electricity, casting its beams over the entire metropolis. A battery of light artillery in Washington, stationed on the Armory, thundered forth a national salute of 37 guns. The Metropolitan bells chimed in National Centennial March, introducing the favorite tunes of this and other nations, and there was a general ringing of bells, large and small. There were similar demonstrations in Alexandria and at Georgetown, and ceremonies at the White House, in accordance with time-honored usage. Despite all this celebrating, for stalwart politicians, Grant is unpopular right now. He served 2 full terms. And not only do the American people tend to get tired of presidents after 2 full terms, but there's been a financial crisis. And it wasn't getting better. Midterms had elected Democrats in 1874 or in 1875, resulting in investigations by that new Democratic House, which led to the discovery of Grant administration scandals. The whiskey ring is the big one. But also a scandal where Grant's own lieutenant, Oliver Babcock, was involved. Secretary of War, all of these several administration folks don't look good coming out of all this investigating. Grant's not going to run again. He's eligible at this time. We don't have the 22nd Amendment yet. He's eligible this time to run for a 3rd term. He chooses not to. Republicans have been in power for 15 years, minus a few years of Andy Johnson. There's still federal troops in the South, and that's a problem now in some areas of the North, particularly where Democrats have a fighting chance in a congressional district or a state. Arthur's position is a federal one. Arthur would lose that position just as soon as a Democratic president was elected. Democrats in New York had Samuel Tilden, a Democratic governor of New York. And as much as Republicans would try to use the issue of the corruption of Tammany Hall against it, well, Samuel Tilden actually, as a Democratic governor, had fought Tammany Hall, had reduced the organization. Call us corrupt. How about you? Now the finger is pointed at Republicans. Chester Arthur is in the New York paper warning the Republicans, Saratoga meeting, they had better, in effect, get their act together if they want to win in 1876. They have a simple plan. They're going to run Roscoe Conkling for president, and then everything will be put right. Conkling and Arthur feel that they have done everything to win over the New York State Party, but as we read in Thomas Reeves' Gentleman Boss here, they had a little trouble at the state convention before they even get to the national one. Some Conkling supporters predicted as many as 4/5 of the New York State delegates would vote for a resolution endorsing Roscoe Conkling for the presidency. Supremely confident, Chester Arthur and others arrived by train only the day before, but the stalwarts had badly underestimated the desire for reform within their party. Soon, George William Curtis, as the publisher of Harper's Weekly, was on his feet, winning thunderous applause for a slashing attack upon his own president, upon the Grant administration. We as Republicans are yet conscious of what we need at a time when every one of us knows, whether any one of us are willing to openly to confess it or not, that the party name that we cherish so sacredly has been stained with foul disgrace, the corruptions of administrations exposed in every direction, and culminating, at last, in the self-confessed bribery of the Republican Secretary of War. Conkling workers had initially attempted to push through a resolution supporting the unit rule that would make the convention appear to endorse a Conkling nomination unanimously. In other words, whoever gets the majority gets the whole state. But sensing the degree of dissent at the meeting, they backtrack a bit and settle for a resolution simply calling for Conkling's name to be presented at Cincinnati. 251 of the 423 New York delegates vote in favor of the motion. 113 support George William Curtis's proposal to send an uninstructed delegation, Cincinnati, vote for whomever they want. And 138 don't vote at all. That's a setback for the New York senator, and it damaged his initial efforts to attain the nation's highest political honor. He wanted to go with New York's unanimous votes. Here's the New York Times. They write of the tyranny which has dominated the Republican Party for the last half-dozen years. This has been one of the most momentous days in the history of the Republican Party in the Empire State, for it has shown that it is at last ready to cast off the shackles of self-appointed managers and assert its own dignity. Yet Conkling still won the vote, and the motion to present Conkling's name passed. So New York is going to present Conkling, however they feel about it. This is what E.L. Goodkin, one of the reformers, writes. Here we have on the one side the leading commercial city of the Union, the entire body of respectable Republicans and the entire moral force of an active political club, whose leading members are looked to supply a large amount of the sinews of war during the campaign. On one hand, we have all those throwing their weight against the nomination for president of a man whose only local qualifications had been that he's a bitter partisan defender and apologist of every abuse that has sapped the sources of the commercial prosperity of this state. On the other hand, we have a small body of office holders headed by obscure men of doubtful or worse than doubtful reputation. Arthur's one of those people he's talking about. So you're hearing the bad side. Look, and we've got to discuss this. Arthur is part of a political machine, and there are many people like Godkin who feel that all of these positions, all of the taxes that are put on to fund these offices are coming at the expense of good commercial sense. You still have that thought in American politics today in a lot of different forms, that only the private sector jobs matter and government's just sort of attaching itself. But it was even more true then when, it was definitely more true then when some of these offices created did not have clear roles. So they get to Cincinnati, go immediately from the New York Convention to Cincinnati, June 8th. A huge banner was printed up for President Roscoe Conkling. Arthur's there, not an official delegate to the convention, but not a mere spectator. Tom Platt, who is going to take over from Conkling afterwards, is also present, and this is going to be one of his big first efforts. There's a train with 150 Conkling supporters that arrives in Cincinnati. It brought its own band, huge banner bearing Conkling's portrait. All through western Pennsylvania and Ohio, it staged large and loud demonstrations for Conkling. Cincinnati, Arthur meets the train. 9 p.m. The band's playing, the banners are flying, there's a noisy parade to the Grand Hotel, and the New York delegation rented it, that hotel, and decorated it. A New York Times reporter noted, "All the hotels are filled with New York men. The streets are lined with them, and indeed it seems as if they had captured the city." One reformed guy sneers. He looks at the Grand Hotel crowd and says, "Where did the custom house get bail money for all those fellows?" Godkin says the platform in Cincinnati and the floor were filled with postmasters, collectors, supervisors, and others. But they're not without opposition. The Reform Club of New York is there. The Union League Club, which Arthur's a member of, but most of them are with the Reform movement. They're here. They're present. Bristow Club of Cincinnati. Bristow had been Treasury Secretary under Grant and investigated the whiskey ring, with not much help from Grant. And he's being seen as maybe you should make him president to give Republicans a new image. James Blaine has his supporters, and some of them are New York, from Western New York. You have people for Oliver P. Morton, the governor of Indiana, been crucial during the Civil War, and some people for an obscure governor who just got elected in Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. The 70 official delegates from New York meet in caucus, and 68-2, they say they'll support Conkling, at least for the first few ballots. The problem that they're going to have is the convention at Cincinnati is nervous about what the scandals of the Grant administration. They want to get away from Grant. The Conkling argument is going to be, we've got New York. We can win New York. You have this political machine working for your candidate. As a Republican, you're going to get the White House. Reuben Fenton's one of the people that they're considering as an alternative to him, but certainly Blaine. Blaine doesn't attend the convention because he's sick. He faints. And it's well reported in the papers in Washington Society. Some believe that he kind of faked the incident to get attention. But he's getting votes, and he could be in danger of getting the nomination. Of note, a young Theodore Roosevelt makes a speech against Conkling. Nobody cares too much at this time because he's not a power player at all. But it does get good reviews. But there's not just Theodore Roosevelt opposing Conkling. It's a lot of folks. And by the second and third ballot, Conkling fades. What to do? To some degree, the Conkling New York people and Arthur and the Stalwarts were already boxed in. They had told fans of obscure Governor Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the Ohio race, despite a Democratic surge, saying that he would go for reconciliation in the country. Some of these folks they made deals with would support Conkling in ballots 1, 2, a few in 3, and then after that, in some cases, Conkling people have said, if there's a 4th ballot, we'll go for your man. This is the way 19th century conventions work, going into the 20th century. It's great to win on the first ballot. You're going to try to win on the first or the second, convincingly, because it's going to be hard after that for the front runner. What happens is as they start getting past the second and third, and Conkling's running out of steam, some of the people already, even in New York, have to vote for Hayes because of commitments they made. And there's now a boom for Hayes. They don't want Blaine. There is a movement for Blaine. There's a lot of cheers. There's a fantastic speech that's delivered for Blaine, but people don't really trust him. He seems to grab onto whatever political issue of the moment he can. This time, most recently, it was an effort to not award citizenship to Jefferson Davis, which, I mean, a lot of Northerners support, of course, but it also had the earmarks of that really political issue that you're just kind of grasping onto. So people don't like him for that. So, oddly enough, once Conkling realizes that he's cooked, as hard as it is, they say, okay, we'll go for Hayes. The New York Times asked Chester Arthur in an interview, and Arthur says, I'm all for Hayes. New York is all for Hayes. And he replaces his Conkling ribbon with a Hayes ribbon. This was okay with Conkling. He knew the game was over. And maybe they figure, we don't know him that well, but hey, Hayes, at least he's not Blaine. That would be the worst outcome. So in the election of 1876, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes runs against Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden of New York. Top candidate, real top. Democrats have the best candidate they've had since the Civil War. Now, the way that Hayes is going to end up, first of all, we should note that Arthur does fundraising. The New York State Democrats do all kind of fundraising for the Hayes ticket. Here's from Reeves again. Campaign funds were badly needed by Republicans in 1876, and predictably, they turned to the New York Custom House, where Collector Arthur was firmly determined to see that each party appointee paid every penny of his assigned donation. Silas Burt recalled that the official enforcement of voluntary contributions to the state committee was more severe and ruthless than I have ever known it. Deputies paid 4% of their salaries, 5% for weighers. An alderman, Colonel Joseph Pinckney, personal friend of Arthur, was given a complete list of the names of persons employed in the Custom House and their salaries. He opened an office on Hanover Street, which some called Handover Street, directly across from the Custom House, where employees were advised to report and pay their assessments. Burt says, the utter banality and insulting conduct of these political tax gatherers, I am certain it was thought necessary by intimidation to crush out any spark of revolt. Burt is the only one employed by the Custom House. Again, he's a civil service official who doesn't pay. It's estimated he collected $50,000 for the Hayes campaign. This is going to be important later because Hayes is going to be very much a proponent of reform and things, but, Also, Arthur's friend Morgan is going to put together a group of people which will also produce $50,000. Arthur will write a check for that. Here's what Reeves says about the disputed election. Though he made no public statement on the disputed election, Collector Arthur may have assisted Republican leaders in influencing the outcome. William Chandler, who was in a position to know, wrote that General Arthur's activity in connection to the contested countings in the southern states was of vital importance. But probably, Reeves says, his role was limited to fundraising. He wrote a $5,000 check to Zachariah Chandler, head of the Republican National Committee, that might have greatly assisted the chairman passing out sums of money to ensure victory in the carpetbag states. He may have been instrumental in securing funds through the unscrupulous money baron Jay Gould, whose assistance had been requested, sometimes in code, throughout the campaign. In a guarded letter of December 4th, marked private, Arthur wrote to Gould, I have seen several gentlemen in regard to the matter which we talked about when I last saw you, and expect to have in the morning some information as to the result. I'm going to Washington at 1 o'clock tomorrow, for a day or two, and will see you on my return. But at the same time, Arthur's boss, in quotes here, Conkling, is what Reeves said, decided to throw in his lot with Tilden. He assumed that with Arthur assisting Republican moves to elect Hayes, he and his machine could make solid claims to perpetuity, no matter which candidate had won. Conkling knew that Hayes was surrounded by Schurz and Curtis, and there would be little hope for stalwarts in such an administration. Conkling makes no statement on the matter of this disputed election. He serves as a member of a joint committee created to iron out charges by Democrats and Republicans. But word leaks back to Hayes from John Sherman, senator from Ohio, that the New Yorker would not favor Republican claims in 2 of the 3 disputed Southern elections. Conkling leads the fight in the Senate for an electoral commission. But Republicans don't want a commission. See, the Congressional Commission is going to investigate whether the state belongs to Hayes. Hayes just wants the states. So Conkling's a little bit more of a compromiser, but in doing so, that's positions favored by Democrats and opposed by Republicans, including a number of stalwarts. The New York Times snarled, "This state supplies 1/3 of the Republicans voting in favor of the bill, a fact which may be explained in 3 words: commerce, cowardice, and Conkling." Matthew Quay of Pennsylvania, another senator boss, wrote Hayes on January 20th, "Conkling is undoubtedly faithless. I am assured by friends of Tilden that he is in correspondence with him." But he never publicly cut any ties with Hayes. So it's interesting here. So we're always told that like Arthur and Conkling are in lockstep, and maybe they are. Maybe Arthur knows exactly what Conkling is doing. But during this disputed election, Conkling and Hayes are sort of on different sides. Here's how Matthew Josephson writes it in his Politicos. I like this book. It's from the 1930s, looking back at the political events of the later 19th century. The intervention of Roscoe Conkling at this stage was most curious. A relentless partisan in politics all his life, he now acted to aid the Democratic cause by urging acceptance of Justice Davis's and the Electoral Count Bill as a magnanimous solution which averted danger of civil war. "He who ruleth his own spirit is greater than he who taketh a city," Conkling said in defending the program and siding with Democrats. Conkling's going to start adopting the term Rutherford Hayes that Democrats would say about President Hayes, his own party's president. But he picked up on things before others. He would see that Hayes was meeting with the half-breed, the group opposed to the stalwarts. Conkling says at one point, Tilden was legally elected. This is not going to endear him to GOP ranks, and it separated him from other New York GOP. And so we have a difference, at least in activity, between Arthur and Conkling at this stage. We don't know that Arthur felt differently, but we know Arthur's working to get Hayes elected, and Conkling's pretty happy with Hayes not being elected at this point. Once in office, Conkling was right. Hayes made it clear that the party must mend its ways, and that meant largely going after the stalwart faction. Although he also did not appoint anyone that Blaine might have liked, he tried to appoint independents, most notably in the Treasury. Senator John Sherman of Ohio, the brother of the Civil War general, he places in Treasury, and Sherman can't be claimed by either the half-breeds or the Stalwarts. For Rutherford Hayes, there's a diary, so we have a lot of his thoughts, and for instance, the way that he was elected, all of the dealings that go on between Democrats and Republicans. There's a meeting at the Wormley Hotel in which it's said that that's where it was agreed federal soldiers would be removed from the South. All of these things he just sees as a bit of holy work to ensure a Democratic president didn't get the place that he was sitting. And now that he was here, he was going to clean up the Republican Party, remove the last federal soldiers in order to bring reconciliation in the country so there's no armed presence anywhere there doesn't need to be. He removes soldiers from South Carolina and Louisiana. He doesn't comment when he does it. For Conkling, Hayes was not legally elected, and given this removal of federal troops, the last guarantor, Conkling believes, of the rights of newly enfranchised African American citizens, there'll be no protection for them. And not only that, because this was part of a deal, Conkling thinks Hayes was not legally elected and now did not deserve the office. This proved it. With John Sherman at the Treasury, Hayes would set his sights on the New York Custom House, really right after he's elected. He complains of the activities that are going on there in an executive order. No officer should be required or permitted to take part in the management of political organizations, caucus conventions, or electoral campaigns. Also, no assessments for political purposes should be allowed. Sherman is mixed on this whole policy. He thinks it's going to start a war within the party that they don't need. But as we know today, it's an executive order. It's what he must does. And so there's another factor, too. In cabinet, the Secretary of State, William Evarts, who Arthur knows from his legal days, had been a corporate lawyer for businesses in New York. And businesses in New York felt very put upon by the Customs Department, that it was an extra tax on their activities, that it was reducing their own profits, just to give some folks some offices. So Evarts is going to be one of the strongest voices within the Hayes cabinet now to pursue this policy of a presidential civil service reform, in a sense, in using executive orders to replace people who were playing politics. They have John Jay of New York investigate the Custom House for Treasury Department, and they find no wrongdoing, no illegal activity. They can't pin anything on Chester Arthur that he actually did. But there are a few things, like lackadaisical, or laxity is the word that John Jay uses, noting that Arthur came in late, and most notably the politics, the use of the department for party activities. Now, this is not a slam dunk, and that's what has to be seen in the story of what's going to happen to Chester Arthur and his job at the collector's house. It's not a slam dunk case. So what they do is they ask Arthur politely, resign now, avoid any kind of public shame, and we'll give you a spot at the consulate in Paris. Paris is lovely. I'm sure Arthur would love, a man of refinement would love a trip to Paris, but Arthur and Conkling know what is going on here. And they're not going to resign. You'll have to fire me. And so President Hayes suspends Arthur. Now, as far as I know, I don't think about this one, it is the first time that a president has fired a future president, as far as I know. Now, what's going to happen now? Well, they're not going to take this lying down. Roscoe Conkling and Arthur will fight back in several ways. The first is the New York State Convention in Rochester, September 1877, right after the suspension. It will really be an anti-Hayes convention. When Arthur appears on the floor of the Rochester Convention, there is an outbursts of applause for him. He's really a martyr now among the stalwart movement for losing his job for no other, really they couldn't pin anything on him. Conkling makes a speech attacking the reformers in the state. He points at George William Curtis, publisher of Harper, as the leader of the reform movement in New York. Who are these men who in newspapers and elsewhere are cracking their whips over Republicans and playing schoolmaster to the party and its conscience and its convictions? Whose efforts have been expended in denouncing and ridiculing and accusing honest men who in storm and in sun, in war and peace, have clung to the Republican flag and defended it against those who have tried to trail and trample it in the dust. Some of them have attempted to belittle and befoul Republican administrations, he's referring to Grant, and parade their own thin veneerings of superior purity. Some of these worthies masquerade as reformers. Their vocation is to lament the sins of other people. Their stock in trade is rancid, canting, self-righteousness. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. Their real object is office and plunder. When Dr. Johnson defined patriotism as the last refuge of the scoundrel, Conkling sneers. He was unconscious of the then undeveloped capabilities and uses of the word reform. Upon the last sentence, Conkling's delivery was indeed theatrical. His auditors remember how slowly he drawled, and the R's rolled, the syllables hissed, thus abandoning himself to the hate, lunging and stabbing at the new and strange tenets for Republicans, at the apostates, the betrayers, those who had cast truthless aspersions upon the glorious Grant. He got applause there. The orator then made an unforgettable picture for the crowd, painted with all the colors of personal invective and derision. The nonsense over civil service reform was but a Chinese war of noises. Curtis is the editor of a family journal made famous by the pencil of Nast, the cartoonist. He delivered the most revealing and memorable observation. They forget that parties are not built upon by deportment or by ladies' magazines or gush. After this speech, the vote happens, and Conkling's slate is overwhelmingly elected. It is a rejection of Hayes and his removal of Arthur from the Customs House. What's the response? Hayes names a nominee to replace Arthur. Arthur had just been suspended. Hayes names a nominee to replace Arthur at the Customs House. This is Theodore Roosevelt Sr. We don't hear a lot about Theodore Roosevelt's father, but he was a businessman. He was involved, the Roosevelt family was involved in banking. It really stems out of their previous hardware and plate glass business that goes all the way back to the 1700s in New York City. They made enough money doing that they were able to lend money out, first lending money to customers to buy products, and then just doing commercial banking on their own. And so Roosevelt Sr. is one of these leading businessmen in New York City who want reform, who want the custom house to reduce its fines and fees, that think we have too many political offices and people are getting rich off political office instead of industry. So there's a real fight, even though they're all Republicans. There's a real fight between the business Republicans and the political Republicans under Conkling and Arthur at this time. Now, as you heard with Conkling, the other side of this that an Arthur or Conkling might say is that the business people just, not only are they greedy, but they want the Republicans to win magically without raising any money for the fight. And they're going to get destroyed by the Democrats. This will be Conkling's constant refrain. Now, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. is not well known yet. We did refer to how he made a speech in 1876. He loved his father. His father was strict. His father was a big part in making Roosevelt who he was. And obviously he's watching this fight as a youth just getting involved in politics. He's later going to become a civil service commissioner, which will be apt. Yet at this point, it's his father who's appointed. His father will not get to serve in that office. And part of the reason is that Conkling goes to the Senate. And to the Senate, he says, New York, I'm a senator from New York. I wasn't consulted on this position. Do you want a president like Hayes who's going to go to all of your states and trample over your rights as senators? And one thing about senators, whether they agree with you or disagree with your position, they agree with their rights. And largely the Senate agrees. Even James Blaine, who bitterly hates Conkling, he doesn't want President Hayes making a decision about Maine without consulting him. So the vote goes 35-21 to reject Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and also the naval officer that Hayes appoints, and send the nomination back. He does not get the advice of the Senate. It's a stunning blow for Hayes to have his own party's senators joining. And Red Hayes writes in his diary, "Conkling has won a victory, or so the press says. The end is not yet. I am right. I have no plans to give up." He'll bide his time, and then in 1879, Rutherford B. Hayes will submit 2 names again to replace Arthur, who's still suspended. Arthur's doing a law practice at this point. Treasury Secretary John Sherman is important here. In the beginning, in the 1877 battle, Sherman's more like, hey, just doing my job kind of thing. What? A cabinet secretary just sort of going through the motions, not really liking what they're doing? Okay. And that's the kind of sense you get. He's very consultative with Arthur. He makes statements that, this is nothing about Arthur or anything like that. This is just something we're looking at as a matter of policy. It changes a bit as you get to 1879, and Sherman starts going more to war publicly, legislatively with the Stalwarts. Why is that? It looks like Sherman, Rutherford B. Hayes has already announced he's going to be a one-term president. And it's interesting because as I record this, we have a president who must be constitutionally a one-term president. And you get that kind of who's going to be next then. And the different factions start competing. And John Sherman is the most likely nominee for the kind of administration man, the President Hayes type candidate. And so he starts getting more forceful in the fight and attacking the Stalwarts directly. And in 1879, during a recess, when Congress can't block him, Hayes once again submits names for the Treasury to replace Arthur and to replace Alonzo Cornell, who was the naval officer, who's also a stalwart. What's the reaction? Once again, the Stalwarts go to the State Convention of New York to express their opposition. You got to understand what this means. This isn't just about a couple jobs. The job that Arthur had was necessary to keep the organization together, to raise money, to really have a political machine. Without it, Conkling's got very little power. He's just a senator from New York, and indeed, he knows when his term comes up again, he's not going to be senator from New York. The legislature, if they don't control the legislature, he'll pick someone else. So the next stop is the state convention. Arthur is asked to run for governor. That's how well known, that's how much his martyrdom extends in GOP politics in the state of New York. But he declines to run. So far, he has not run for elective office before. He's always been a behind-the-scenes guy. He's going to increase his practice in this particular campaign. So Alonzo Cornell, who, same family as the college, who was the naval officer fired at the same time as Arthur, is run for governor. He doesn't have the personality of Arthur. People would really rather have Arthur run for governor. A lot of people like him and don't like Cornell as much. He's just not a very affable or likable person. Even Arthur doesn't really like him that much. So getting him elected is going to be a little tough. But he's got Conkling behind him. All Conkling wants is a loyal person. And they get the state convention to vote for Cornell, to vote for the Conkling slate. There is an additional issue that reformers threaten to bolt the party, but they're not going to actually leave the party. They say that Cornell was only put in through, the machinery, so a so-called scratcher movement comes in, that they're going to vote for every Republican but scratch out the name of Alonzo Cornell. And this gets good coverage in newspapers, and GOP is a little bit scared, and they're saved by one thing. They luck out. The Democrats. in the 1879 gubernatorial election are also split. Samuel Tilden doesn't run, but he has a candidate, Robinson, who runs for governor on the Democratic ticket. But usually you'd get Tammany Hall to really bring out the Irish immigrant vote for a Democratic candidate for governor at this time. But Jim Kelly, who is the boss of Tammany Hall at this time, splits from the official Democratic Party and runs himself. And meanwhile, comparatively speaking, the GOP, despite its splits, are more unified. In fact, Alonzo Cornell, once established as a Republican candidate, it's hard for speakers to not accept an invitation to speak on his behalf. He's going to be governor of New York, perhaps. So even John Sherman, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, who had fired Arthur, in effect, speaks about Cornell. Actually, had fired Cornell as well. Speaks about Cornell and says, "I know of no objection to Mr. Cornell's character." James Blaine speaks too on behalf of Cornell. Everybody's unified. Conkling, of course, tours the state. "This is the greatest election since the canvass of 1860, he says. And something else. Even though Hayes doesn't want the GOP-controlled Custom House to be assessing employees anymore, it doesn't stop. The records of who the employees are and what they paid in the past are kept by the Republican State Committee. They have them. They set up the same office nearby the Custom House and request that employees go there to pay their assessment. They do not comply. From what we hear from the reformer side, at least, the same threat of being fired is given during the Hayes administration, not with Hayes' knowledge, but by these Republican operatives in New York, as ever was done. So they're still raising money, even in this election. 50 years old, he had been participating in election drives most of his life and had studied under masters of campaign management as Weed and Morgan. He was now wholly in his element and expressed relief at being freed from the drudgery and constant assault associated with the Custom House. The New York Times censured him on other grounds, but here in the campaign matters they commented, "The committees of both parties have worked as committees seldom worked before. General Chester Arthur, the chairman of the Republican organization, has been most conspicuous in this respect. His unbounded energy and scrupulous attention to the most minute detail have astonished even those who knew him to be a man of much resource and executive ability." Among Arthur's tasks was the recruitment of speakers to perform at hundreds of meetings held in every village, every city in the state. Sometimes the speechmakers were local officials or dignitaries, but Arthur also attempted to import some of the party's most prominent figures. Cornell wins, but he only wins because that Democratic vote was split. The Tammany ticket gets 77,000, and Tilden's ticket gets 375,000. Cornell gets just over 400,000 votes and wins the election. Now, state offices are available to the Conkling machine, and the state legislature is beholden to the governor and the state offices, and Arthur and some other lieutenants go up to Albany and start setting up the legislature. Very important is that George Sharp, who's an employee of the Custom House, one of the people fired at the same time as Arthur, and is a friend of Arthur, is established as the Speaker of the Assembly of New York. That's important because all the people fired by Hayes, big ones, Arthur, Sharp, Cornell, in defiance to Hayes, as a big kind of take that to Hayes, 2 of the 3 have jobs, leaving Arthur. And that's going to inform why later it's not so strange that Arthur's going to get a position that we'll talk about in the next episode. As he's organizing the legislature, Arthur's not so concerned with jobs. He's getting points for his work on the governor's campaign. He's in Albany basking in success. He's putting together a state government. And then telegram. Nell Arthur was sick. Come home immediately. His wife caught pneumonia. Friends would tell reporters later that it seems like because she was bringing her mother's body home and had to go to Europe for that purpose. But as biographer Thomas Reeves says, the timeline on that story doesn't work. She was back in New York for 19 months later. So perhaps the grieving hurt, but it wasn't immediately after. It's just the most random thing. Goes to a concert and waits too long outside for a carriage. Catches a cold that turns to pneumonia. The only vehicle Chester Arthur could take from Albany on a Sunday morning was a milk train that crept agonizingly downstate. He arrived late in the evening and rushed home to find Nell under the influence of morphine, administered by her physician. She was never to regain consciousness. Arthur remained at her bedside for more than 24 hours, till it was over. He 50, she 42. Funeral services were held at the Church of the Heavenly Rest on Fifth Avenue, and the city machine turned out almost to a man. The State Assembly passes a resolution of sympathy for Chester Arthur, who had just lost his father 4 years earlier, and now this. There's only so much that a resolution by a state legislature can help you with grieving. He was distraught by all accounts. In one account found him walking down 29th Street between 3rd and 5th, over and over again, sometimes late into the night. He tells Nell's father, his father-in-law, "Honors are to me now, not what they once were.